Welcome everyone, good afternoon. My name's Professor Henrietta Moore. I'm the founder and director of the Institute for Global Prosperity. Lovely to see you here at this joint event with the Development Planning Unit on mental health and the city. And I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by our speakers for this third joint event between the IGP and the DPU. We've had two great discussions, and I know this is going to be a third one. So lovely to see everyone, as I said, and we are joined today, and I will introduce speakers properly at the end of my introductory remarks, but Professor Nicholas Rose, Dr. Leda McKay, Dr. Liza Griffin, and Hannah Sender, who are going to be our discussants. So today's discussion promises to be particularly interesting because we know that there is a clear relationship between where we live and our psychological and emotional well-being. But little is actually currently known about the precise role that place plays in our mental health. And that's quite extraordinary when you think about the fact that over half the world's population, around 4.2 billion people, actually live in cities. So the research we do have shows that those living in deprived areas are at increased risk of developing mental disorders. And children who grow up in poorer households are at an elevated risk of being mentally unwell compared to their peers. Those living with psychoses find that their symptoms can be made worse by living in stressful environments, including loud or busy places, and the risk of developing psychosis is an astonishing 77% higher in urban than in rural dwellers. And the risk of developing depression or anxiety is about 20% higher in urban residents. However, having said that, fully appreciating the ways that mental health and place are connected has proven to be elusive for researchers and service providers alike, hindering, I think, effective responses in healthcare and in urban planning. Urban areas have long been associated in literature and in popular discourse, as well as in research terms, with factors which contribute or are thought to contribute to mental ill health. And challenges to mental health prevalent in many cities include things like loneliness, threats of violence, high crime rates, homelessness, noise and other pollutants, traffic accidents, drug abuse, and of course insufficiency of mental health service provision. And this raises the question, a difficult question, about whether there might be something profoundly robust about or innate even about city life that contributes to mental ill health. For instance, does density of urban living conditions or higher costs of living or urban poverty precipitate or amplify mental health conditions and well-being in cities? And since there is at least debate on the relationship between mental health and place, as I said earlier, it's difficult perhaps to identify what it is about the urban that might contribute to elevated rates of mental ill health and lack of mental well-being. However, emerging research suggests that as well as representing part of the problem, cities can be the focus of so-called mental health solutions. For instance, improving access to green spaces and providing nature-based solutions may be helpful in preventing mental disorders and in alleviating their psychological symptoms. So our speakers and panel today will look at whether and how we can navigate and comprehend complex relationships between people, place, poverty, and marginalisation to identify specific elements of the urban realm as perhaps precipitating factors of mental ill health or mental well-being. They will consider if we can design urban places for good mental health and how planners might go about governing for mental health or taking it into account in more successful ways across all the kinds of private and public spaces that we inhabit. So let me introduce our speakers before I ask Professor Nicholas Rose to be our first speaker. So Professor Rose is Honorary Professor in the Institute of Advanced Studies, University College London, and Distinguished Honorary Professor in the Research School of Social Sciences at the Australian National University. He founded the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College in 2012 and was co-director of the King's ESRC Centre for Society and Mental Health until his retirement. His most recent book is The Urban Brain, Mental Health and the Vital City, written with Des Fitzgerald, which was published by Princeton University's Press in the spring. and he is, of course, founder and senior editor of Biosocial, an interdisciplinary journal for social studies of the life sciences, and has written a very large number of books. And his current research concerns the role of the life sciences and the neurosciences in changing conceptions of human identity, normality, and pathology. And our second speaker is Dr. Leila Mackay, who's Director of the Centre for Urban Design and Mental Health, a psychiatrist by background, and having held diverse roles in international health policy, she provides leadership at the nexus of urban design and mental health, alongside her role as policy director of the NHS Confederation. She's held academic roles at Georgetown University, Johns Hopkins University, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And she edits the Journal of Urban Design and Mental Health. And her book, Restorative Cities, Urban Design for Mental Health and Wellbeing, was recently published by Bloomsbury. And our two discussants today, Dr. Liza Griffith is lecturer in environmental politics at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit, and her research makes contributions in three main areas: in politics, environmental governance and resilience, in health and spatial politics, and in creative practice and environmental politics. And Hannah Sender is Research Fellow at the Institute for Global Prosperity, and Hannah's current research focuses on the relationship between adolescence, societal change, and mental health. And she is interested in how changes in urban areas affects adolescents' everyday lives, subjectivities, and futures. So welcome to you all. Wonderful to have you here. Thank you for coming. And please, could I invite our first panellist, which is you, Nick. So please, Professor Nicholas Rose.
Thanks very much, Henrietta. You'll have to excuse me. Bloomsbury is very thick with pollen at the moment, and I was delighted to see you all in person and not through a screen. It nonetheless means that pollen is in my system. Thanks very much for inviting me here. I have, as Henrietta said, thanks for the kind introduction, just published this book on urban mental health, but I'm not actually going to talk in great detail about the book itself, because there's a book launch happening for the book next week, I think. So I thought I'd take the opportunity of talking a little bit about some of the conceptual underpinnings of the work that went into that book, and I hope that will lead well into what Leila is going to say. So I call this Biosocial Ecologies of Urban Mental Health, and with the rather awkward title, for which you have to forgive me, of Neuro-Eco-Sociality, which is the title of a paper which I wrote with colleagues Nick Manning and Rasmus Bierk a year or so ago. Okay, so just to kick off, today we increasingly rely on the life sciences, in particular biomedicine, when we fix us when we suffer, to drugs, devices, and augmentations of all sorts. But when I say we, of course I mean we mainly in the wealthy global north. And when I say when we suffer, I mean when we suffer from physical ill health, but much less when we suffer from mental distress. So because of that absence of a capacity to actually intervene when people get mentally distressed, or limitations of that capacity, let me put it like that, perhaps we should start at the other end. And as Henrietta said, I was previously working in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and I guess I want to take a social medicine approach to these issues, but in particular to see the ways in which the life sciences, working with the social sciences, can help us understand the impact of social suffering, of systematic inequality and structural violence on our bodies and our souls. And one of the things I've been working on for ages, not with too much success, is to try and get the social and human sciences to work collaboratively with the life sciences to recognize the fact that we are living beings and that social inequity and structural violence is inscribed deeply in our bodies and souls, and if we take those things seriously, then we have to address the mechanisms by which they are inscribed. Now, I've got some concerns about the very expansive language of mental health, which we've seen especially in the time of COVID, when everything is dangerous to our mental health. But leaving that to one side, we know that mental distress, however coded, is very widespread in the global north and in the global south, Henrietta gave us some data, so I won't repeat that. So I suppose my question here is, can the urban experience help us understand how social suffering gets under the skin? And I guess my concern is not so much directly with planning, but what one might call with urban justice. What would it mean to imagine a city that was mental health friendly, that acted on the pathways and mechanisms that led to mental distress, that sought to create what I call the scaffolds, a term which I borrowed from Kim Strelny, the scaffolds for the material, biological, economic, social and semantic scaffolds that might mitigate social distress, to shape the conditions of vital existence in the name of social justice. So to begin, the project which was the sort of practical underpinnings of the work that led to the Urban Brain Book, and what I'm going to talk about now, was called M3, Mental Health, Migration and the Megacity. And it sought to explore mental distress, urban mental distress, through the lens of migration, with a specific focus on two cities, Shanghai and Sao Paulo. Now, there have been many inconclusive studies of mental health and mental disorder in migrants, and most of those were focused on trans-border migration. But now, as in the 19th century, the major driver of urbanization has actually been migration from rural areas into cities. And if you think in particular about the megacities of the global south, you can see the way in which, in these little pictures here, which are just there to gesture towards this, you can see the way in which migration from the countryside and from small towns and villages into the cities has driven migration in the global south in those four top areas as opposed to these bottom areas. I can go back to that graph if anyone wants to talk about that in any more detail. So in some way, the figure of the migrant, if we're thinking about the city and mental health globally, the figure of the migrant is the key figure, not that irritating figure of the flaneur we all think about when we think about cities, but the figure of the migrant in trying to understand the consequences of urbanization. So what might be the consequences for the mental lives of those migrants to megacities? So as soon as we started doing this, we realized that to put it like that was a completely dopey way of trying to put it. This project was founded, as so many empirical research projects are, on pretty much a misunderstanding of what the issue was. So I had spent some time for various reasons in Shanghai. And if you land at the airport in Shanghai, which is in Pudong, and you get a car to take you to the old city, you pass these piles of skyscrapers like that. Very densely packed. And I, in my naivety, when we were starting this project, thought that the migrants to Shanghai, 26 million people, about a third of whom are migrants from the countryside, I thought the migrants from Shanghai lived in those tower blocks. But in fact, when we started to do our work, we found that the migrants in Shanghai lived in urban villages like Songjiang, which is where we actually did some of our empirical research. Okay, that's one thing. That's another thing. If you look at the cities of Latin America, if you compare people living in favelas, okay, on the one side of the screen are favelas in Rio, on the other side of the screen are favelas in Sao Paulo. They are fundamentally different in construction. Favelas in Rio are right in the center of Rio. You can see the favelas from the centers of Rio. Favelas in Sao Paulo are strung out around the outskirts of Sao Paulo. So, what is a city anyhow? Seems to me that to pose the question in terms of mental health in the city is probably to mispose it. Now, in the 1930s, Louis Wirth famously argued that urbanism was, quote, a way of life in the cities of his age. But there is, and probably never has been, any city. There have been many cities in the city. On the top here, you can see Charles Booth's poverty maps of 1890. And you can see how he traces out street by street by street levels of urban deprivation amongst the people who live there. And this is a much more recent map on the bottom from Chris Gale at UCL of the indices of multiple deprivation in London. That is in 2010. But the point is that there is a complex topography of social injustice and a complex topography of mental distress. So to get to the question which Henrietta kindly posed for us at the beginning, how do you understand the mechanisms that link social injustice and mental health injustice? Is it poverty? Is it stress? Is it diet? Is it pollution? Is it social exclusion? Is it geographical exclusion, loneliness, as Henrietta mentioned? Is it stigma and racism? And how? What by what pathways? So our argument soon became one of the need to move from large-scale correlations to lived experience of the urban milieu. Now, to just give you, we did a lot of mapping, but I'm just happen to have handy these maps of London, if my little pointer still works and its battery hasn't completely gone dead on me, which it has. Oh, it has. Okay, so here are maps of London broken down by borough. This map shows indices of deprivation. The darker the blue, the higher the level of deprivation. This shows infant mortality. The bluer, the lower level of infant mortality. You can see here, which is Havering, the borough of Havering, there's a very high level of social deprivation, but a very low level of infant mortality. So even at the level of boroughs, you can see a huge difference. These ones here, these red dots indicate one of the indicators that one might have of mental distress in cities. This is prescribing from GPs for common mental disorders, prescribing of anti-anxiety, anti-depression drugs and so on. And you can see, you should see that the darker the colour here of these boroughs, the bigger these red blobs. But that isn't the case. In fact, there's very little prescribing for CMDs in Havering, but there's a huge amount of prescribing for CMDs in some of the other boroughs that are much lighter. Okay, so something is going on here that cannot be understood. And you can repeat this again and again with all the indicators that you might have of levels of mental distress, admission to hospital, etc., etc., etc. How does one begin to break that down? So where we started to break that down was to move from thinking about the urban as some kind of conglomerate to thinking about niches, the places, the spaces and pathways within which urban dwellers live their lives, to try and link mental distress to the way in which the city is actually experienced in the everyday life of individuals and of groups, to see the city not as on these gross levels that I've been talking about so far, as a multiplicity of ecological niches within which people work to make their lives viable for themselves, and within which they experience whatever it is that's going to lead them to mental distress. So can one then integrate some neurobiological, some biological insights and methods with these older questions about inequality, poverty, exclusion, racism and violence to begin to make that relationship intelligible? Well, that is in any event what we tried to do. Now, when we started thinking about niches, we began, I'm afraid, with a rather fashionable work these days in the social sciences of James J. Gibson. His work is actually on perception. Because when he started thinking about ecological niches, he tried to overcome the big barrier that you see in almost all psychological and social psychiatric research, which is the barrier between the individual and their environment. You see these pictures of individuals with all the pathways, neuromolecular pathways, or whatever it is, and then somewhere in the corner, black box, the environment. How do you begin to break down the environment? How do you begin to develop what the philosopher John Dewey called at the beginning of the 20th century a transdermal relationship, transdermal understanding of how the environment gets under the skin, or even better, not making that distinction between the environment and the individual. So Gibson coined this term affordances, the affordances of the environment and what it offers to the animal, what it provides or furnishes for good and for ill, the complementarity of the animal and the environment, the way in which certain features of the niche in which people exist or animals exist, certain features of that niche make certain ways of acting possible and certain ways of acting impossible, that tune people to certain ways of being human in particular kinds of environment, or prevent them from certain ways of being human in certain kinds of environments. Can you actually begin methodologically to understand the way in which humans operate in small urban spaces or niches For those of you who've got a social science background, might have come across the work of W.H. White, who did a great deal of work in charting these, the uses of small urban spaces. And you can see that the uses, even in White's work, he did lots and lots of movies and things. The way in which people use the space is not necessarily the way in which the space was designed. Steps, in Gibson's terms, might afford stepping, but they also afford sitting, eating your lunch, or benches might afford lying, or they might afford not lying. Now, when you begin to think about how that might work in a particular city, this is for a very interesting paper called Being Human in Cities, not by my group, but by Greg Downey, looking at Brazilian street kids. You can see the way in which these street kids are constructing certain niches for themselves, certain ways of making what might seem an almost intolerable life. A life of poverty, a life of pollution, a life where they have very limited living, food, where they're scavenging for food, a life where they're begging, a life where the environment is often tremendously polluted, as you can see in that picture there. How they construct their niche for themselves, and what are the embodied consequences of that way of living, of that landscape of living that these Brazilian street kids in this particular instance are going through. How can one begin to understand that? Well, it's quite clear that when human beings live in a particular environment or a particular niche, what they think and how they understand that niche is not just a matter of the objective features of that niche, but how they understand it, how they render it into their thought, how they make it salient and significant for themselves. And to try and understand that, we used a term from Jakob von Uxel called the Umwelt, of course, which is just the German for environment, but in von Uxel's term, it's the kind of internal model that an organism has of its world, shaped by its sensory environment. A dog's is very different from a flea's, is very different from a human being's, for instance. What is salient to us in our environments that we remember, that gives us fear, that gives us pleasure, that evokes certain memories, that evokes certain anxieties, etc. Your Umwelt will not be the same as mine, even if we live in the same place in Google Map. Can one actually understand the mental maps that humans have of the spaces that they inhabit? Well, there have been many attempts to try and do that, going back quite a long time to the work of Kevin Lynch on the image of the city, and just put the cover there, and the work of Stanley Milgram, most notable for his work on obedience, which I'm sure many of you have come across, who did this terrific work getting people to draw psychological maps of the spaces in which they live, the sensory, semantic, affective maps of the spaces and places and pathways that they inhabited. Populated with memories associated with dread, fear, trauma, delight, and hopes, sort of irreal cities that people, irreal places that people live in. Most of those things are non-conscious, they're habitual, but they're constantly in flux and full of uncertainty. And this is a little mental map which you can actually get people to draw if you sit down with someone and say, well, draw a mental map of how you move from one place to another place, and what do you see when you see that, what do you feel when you see that store, what do you feel when you see that church, what do you feel when you see that park. You can begin to map out the irreal world in which people live in their environment. And you can also do it using smartphone technology. This is a particular smartphone technology called the Urban Mind technology, which was developed by former colleagues of mine at King's College London, Andrea Michelli, which polls you as you walk through urban space, asks you where you are, geolocates you, asks you what you can see, are you amongst people, etc., and maps, asks you various simple questions about how you're feeling. So you can actually begin to render this idea of an urban niche as a form of experience of a human being as they find their way through urban spaces, of how they internalize it and how it shapes their meanings and their memories. You can actually begin to do that empirically. Now, of course, not the only thing that shapes the health of individuals as they live in cities is their semantic understanding of the irreal niches that they inhabit. Niches are also highly material, And we're beginning to know a great deal more about how the materiality of those niches actually affects people's mental health. The thing that you've probably all heard of is the microbiome and the gut-brain axis. So you know that we're inhabited by 100 trillion of bugs, and there is increasing evidence, although always a bit problematic, increasing evidence about the way in which diet, through affecting the microbiome, can shape both physical and mental health. And as you'll see in this picture here, there are increasing attempts to actually map the microbiome in space and in time by using this very cleverly equipped laboratory basin to analyze the microbiome through your urine and feces. And of course we know, and we increasingly know even more, the way in which people's health and their mental health is affected by what is generally called the exposure, that is their exposure to pollution across their life course. And again, one can see the way in which exposure to pollution, exposures to put it at its most general, have fundamental effects on the way in which genes are expressed in the body, and especially the way in which genes are expressed in brain. Of course, the most popular way of thinking about the consequences of urban living on mental health is the argument around stress. And indeed, in the urban brain, Des Fitzgerald and I take the stress argument as the lens through which we're going to address this. The work on stress and the city has gone back a very long way. It goes back to Walter Cannon's work on the adrenal responses, the fight and flight response, and Hans Selye's argument that there is a general adaptation syndrome, that prolonged stress, whether that's hot, cold, poison, crowding, leads to toxic consequences, quote, on rats. There's a great deal of work on that, and this work became extremely controversial in the 1950s in relation to the design of cities, as Henrietta mentioned, in particular the density of cities, because it was argued that when cities reached a certain density, something like the crowding responses that rats had would also happen to humans. That crowding and stress response was the reason why people were in the ghettos were, quote, badly behaved, promiscuous, violent, etc., etc., etc. Now all this work on stress up until the 1950s and 1960s founded on a lack of certainty on what stress was. Was stress an objective experience? Was stress my subjective relationship to my objective experience? If stress got into the body, how did it actually get into the body? Well, what we now have is a body of work which has begun to measure the neurobiological consequences of chronic stress. One of the key researchers in this area, Bruce McEwen, unfortunately sadly died about a year ago, but said in the title of one of his papers, the brain shapes what is perceived as stressful and determines the consequences. The brain has a central role in the protective and damaging effects of the mediators of stress and adaptation. And again, just really repeating what Henrietta said, if you are brought up in an environment when you are subject to toxic stress across the early period of your life course, this is likely to have a very severe ongoing consequence for your mental health. And we're beginning to understand the way in which this works through activating cytokines, regulating gene expression, and so on and so forth. And if I had time, I would explain this picture to you, but you can see, if you would like to go and look it up, exactly the way in which, at the moment, people are beginning to think about how that mechanism leads to changes in the hypothalamus, to the activation of the immune system, to epigenetic changes, that is, changes in gene expression, especially in the brain, which leads to behavior changes and changes in mood. So, to begin to wrap this up, because my time must be almost up, can we learn something, say, from stress, by taking what I would call a social medicine approach to stress? Can we do sociological investigations of the niches that urban dwellers inhabit to map the shaping of their stresses by collective experience? Can we see how poverty, exclusion, isolation, racism, violence, the material infrastructure in which they live, the noise, the smell, the touch, and the microbes, can we see how those are translated transdermally into bodies and into souls? That, I think, poses a challenge not just to the neuroscientists who I've been drawing on here, but also to the social scientists who need to go beyond their large-scale correlations of poverty and mental illness, or urban environment and mental illness, or green space and blue space and mental distress, to begin to think about working with people who experience those things, working with people who live in these situations, working with people, as my colleagues in Sao Paulo are doing, in the favela of Sapopemba in the southeast of Sao Paulo, working with them to understand what their subjective experiences are, how they're shaped. Certainly in Sapopemba, shaped by violence and drugs, as anyone who's been to one of the favelas in Sao Paulo knows, how these are translated into neurobiological configurations and what their consequences are. And to put that the other way around, can one think about what in urban life mitigates against stress, how one can redraw those mental maps of the city, how one can reshape urban niches, not through massive smashing down of cities and rebuilding them, but by building on the things where people find certain forms of amelioration of stress, cafes, corner shops, informal friendships, forms of collective organisation, and so on. So that was what I would call an eco-social or biosocial approach to urban justice, looking at the city as a multiplicity of niches, providing affordances for certain ways of being or certain not ways of being, shaped by what's salient to individuals, suffused by memories and values, creating a specific social, cultural and biological worlds within which people live. And one can then hopefully begin to map these biosocial landscapes of opportunity and despair. Because just to repeat where I started, the urban experience in these niches is not just something external to people. Structural violence, inequality, racism, social exclusion, etc., are marked deeply on the bodies and souls of individuals, not just in mental distress, but also in morbidity and in mortality and in a multitude of other ways. And I think it's a little plea, which I've been pleading for so long, that if social scientists and human scientists could effectively work with life scientists to think about those relationships, what I call a revitalized social science, which can work with those who are doing the neurobiological and biological work to open up that black box of the environment and to reframe some of these questions about the rights to the city and urban justice in neurobiosocial terms. I was going to end by talking a little bit about mentally friendly cities, but I know that that is where Layla is going to pick up, so I shall just stop at that point. Thank you very much.
Very much.
For your
Thank you, Nick. So, great, I invite you, please, to give us a few thoughts on a positive thing.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to have to now just ask you to shift the gears of your mind from the existential to the practical. I think that these two talks work quite well together. Because I started life as a psychiatrist, so obviously I had this interest in mental health. And then I started looking at urban health and got quite interested in this concept of how can you design and plan cities for health. And I realised that so much of the conversation was about physical health, which is great, that's obviously incredibly important. But for some reason mental health was being deprioritised. And there were reasons that were given for that. One being that sort of existential. How do you take the complexity of mental health or mental illness with all its multitude of causes and distill that into something useful you can do in planning or design? Others would say, actually, mental health, I feel a bit awkward about talking about that. There's a lot of stigma. And I've done lots of work around the world where people will say, we don't like talking about mental health. We wouldn't, as an architect, as a designer, as a planner, I wouldn't want to say I specialised in mental health, because people will start casting aspersions upon my mental health. There's a lot of stigma out there that has really prevented the progress of mental health research, mental health investment, and putting mental health into the strategy of cities. So really, the reason I started up the Centre for Urban Design and Mental Health was just to kind of help out a bit there, bring together the people who were doing the research and try to amplify that research, get a bit more done, and get it into the hands of the people who could use it to do something useful in cities. So that's where we are, and in this short talk I'm going to take you through a new framework that I developed with my colleague Jenny Rowe, who's at the University of Virginia, called the Restorative Cities Framework. And we essentially developed that after the Centre for Urban Design and Mental Health had been around for about 5 years. We had accumulated more and more research, and it had come from all sorts of interesting places, from planning, design, geographers, engineers, mental health, public health, etc., etc., etc. And all of this research is coming in, and it's really starting to paint a picture. It's no longer really true to be able to hide behind that excuse of, oh, it's too complicated, we don't know what to do, because actually the research is starting to tell us what we can do. And I was trying to distill it into something useful and practical, which is where this came from. Just before I kick off, I just want to make sure that you understand what I understand when I'm talking about mental health and mental disorders, because as you've heard, there are vast numbers of definitions. But for the practical purposes of what I'm thinking about here, I tend to use the World Health Organization ones, which I better read in case I just tell you it incorrectly. Okay, so according to WHO, mental health is a state where a person realizes their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of everyday life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. I think that's a really interesting definition, isn't it? Because quite often when we think of designers and planners and things, we'll talk about, does this place make you feel happy or sad or angry? These are, quite often fleeting feelings. And really, when we're thinking about investing in planning and design for mental health, we need to go beyond that to think, actually, is this going to make a difference to somebody's longer term health if you're going to get the value from that investment? And so it's also helpful to think, what does mental disorder mean? And again, I'll come back to the WHO definition, which is a combination of problems with somebody's thoughts, emotions, behaviours, relationships with other people that come together to essentially stop you being able to fully fulfill that definition of mental health. And we all know about a wide range of mental health disorders: depression, anxiety, PTSD, ADHD, wide variety. Which affect people in cities, and as you've heard, very, very much, in many cases, affect people disproportionately. So what are we going to do about it? Here is the framework that we have developed. I call these pillars. It's not really true they're pillars because they're all interlinked, because I don't have a good word for that. But at any rate, these are the areas that the research really distills into when you're thinking about what can you practically learn and do. So I think that is really helpful to be able to bring together and characterize. But, and you might be thinking, why are you calling it the restorative city? And it's because it's essentially based on restorative urbanism. And it's an environment that helps us to regulate our emotions, recover from mental fatigue, is the sort of very basic description. And really that's what we're thinking about when we're trying to design these environments, so that they help to support people who are at risk of developing mental health problems, and they help to support them to not develop them in the first place, or to recover from them. Clearly, there's all sorts of things that help you recover from mental health problems or not develop them in the first place. I'm just talking about things that we can do with design and planning right now. And all of these things within this framework are underpinned by 4 sort of restorative psychology mechanisms, which you can see here. So fascination, it's designing to create curiosity and interest in the world. Compatibility, that's obviously designing for all the diverse needs that various people using those spaces might extent, which is being able to contextualize yourself within the wider world, being able to look up and out at your horizon, up at the sky, and then being away, which is being able to have a sense of escape from the everyday grind, being able to have that more relaxing ambience. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is quite briefly take you through the seven areas that are described within the Restorative City framework. All these pictures are from the book, so don't put them online because I'm apparently not supposed to do that. But there you go. So yes, so the Green City, nobody's going to be surprised when you hear that the Green City is the first in this framework, because probably the nature exposure and mental health historically have one of the very clearest linkages, and there's tons and tons and tons of research out there that show the links between mental health, particularly depression, anxiety, can also do things like help to reduce the symptoms of dementia or schizophrenia or ADHD. There's all sorts of opportunities. And what architects and designers and planners say to me is, okay, cool, we're hearing that nature does something good to mental health. Is there a secret recipe? Is there a dose? Can I just slap up a tree and fix somebody's mental health? Clearly not. It's kind of frustrating because I don't think the research has quite got to the stage where there's an inverted commas dose. But what's interesting is quantity is clearly important, but it's not all about quantity. Some of the main things that the research is showing are important are quality, how things are maintained, diversity. So if it's just like tons and tons and tons of identical trees, not necessarily going to get the top benefits. And accessibility, particularly how close it is to people's homes, and being able to pass through on your way to your daily routines. So that's all very interesting. People really are interested in this. There's tons of research going on. There's probably people coming up with more and more specific stuff as we speak, which is great. I'll speak just briefly. I'm not going to go through the mechanisms of how all the different things work, but there's interesting stuff when you think about green space. The book is set out in this sort of format where it explains the different mechanisms as they're currently understood. And green space is interesting. There's all sorts of theories. Don't know if you're familiar with them, but for example, there's attention restoration theory. It's one that I quite like, which is you can look at something complex without having to interpret it, and that has a more relaxing experience on your brain. So if you think about, for example, you look at a green traffic light, and it's not a complex interpretation, but you look at it, it's telling you something, you have to figure out what it's saying, you have to take an action. And most things that you look at that are designed in the urban environment are trying to tell you to think or do or feel a certain way. But then you look at a leaf, a green leaf, and it's complex. You can look at it, you can concentrate on it, but it's not compelling you to do further work. And that's essentially what attention restoration theory is, a little bit of what it's about. The stress reduction theory, which is essentially being in nature reduces stress levels via your parasympathetic nervous system. There's the biophilia theory, which is that humans are innately designed to appreciate and like being in nature. I mean, probably there's elements to all those theories. There's also some nice practical theories, like you can use nature to provide shade and solve part of heat island effects that people have. It can improve sleep. It can reduce exposure to pollution in different ways, and it can also provide a context, an environment in which you can do the other stuff that's good for your mental health, like exercising or socializing. So yeah, that's green space. And until quite recently, you kind of spoke about nature exposure as something that's good for your mental health, but there's now probably enough research to split them out into green and blue. Blue space obviously relating to water in all its various forms. Just like with green space, all water is not created equal. If you've got some kind of horrible, stagnant, polluted, dodgy feeling place, it is not going to have the mental health benefits of somewhere that's lovely and clean and flowing water and nice places for you to walk or interact with the water around it. And obviously, we all always know that the poets tell us that water is good for your mental health. It's throughout literature, it's throughout thalassic therapies from centuries and centuries ago. We still see it in spas today. So it's interesting to think about what you can actually do with water to make it beneficial within the city. It works in lots of the same ways as green space, truth be told. So I won't go into tons of detail, but you get the idea. Sensory city is a bit more fun in some ways because it's a bit of a newer idea. None of these things are completely new ideas, but I think that we're ready to progress from the paint something blue and it's relaxing sort of thing, which is not necessarily something that's really based in science. But the sensory city, if you think about the city and how you interact with it from a sensory perspective, if you're a city leader, what do you hear about? Somebody complaining about something. So like, there's a bad smell, go and fix it. This is too noisy, you need to sort out the noise. And there's been a bit of a shift recently towards more interesting ways of using senses positively. So, how can you use smellscapes in different ways? But yeah, the book goes through in detail all the senses, and of course, as we just heard, ambience as well, which I think of as the sixth sense in the city. But I'll give you just a couple of examples. The picture there is from Londonderry. That's the River Foyle. Lots of people were unfortunately committing suicide by jumping off that bridge. So these guys at Urban Scale Interventions were commissioned to come up with a way to stop that happening. And they really moved beyond. You can see that what they've done is they have essentially built a barrier. But what they've done is they've built one that has visual interest and also has interactivity. And it's believed that these things have been have made this concept of a barrier much more successful because it's playing into this sensory things. The other area that I really like, where there's lots of interesting research now, Colin Ellard's a good place to start, is around boring landscapes. So, the concept of you're walking along a block and there's just one big featureless building. And that essentially does not engage your brain in fascination and interest. Instead, it sort of flips you into these negative ruminations that can be associated with depression. And I think that people are getting quite excited at the moment about the potential of just making things more permeable, more interesting, more complex, in order to keep people's brains really thinking about it. There's interesting research about how fast you walk past something super boring versus the sort of meandering approach that you're going to take if there's interesting things to look at, and people measure your brain waves, all sorts of interesting stuff. The neighbourly city, you won't be surprised to hear that social interaction is absolutely key, and clearly planning and design can play interesting roles in doing that. All sorts of examples. I particularly like housing examples, particularly all the different ways of creating intergenerational housing, which is an interesting way to improve people's social capital, which gives them extra resilience for their mental health. But thinking about bumping places, thinking about pedestrianisation, so that people are more likely to encounter their neighbours over and over again in a way that they wouldn't do if they were driving from place to place, or they're living somewhere which is zoned residential only. So there's a lot of argument for these multimodal neighbourhoods where people, you hear about the 15-minute neighbourhood or the 20-minute neighbourhood, and that has a lot of benefits within the neighbourly city. The active city. I mentioned at the very beginning, of course, that physical activity for physical health has been a really big focus of urban design for health over the years. But the sneaky little extra bit is the benefits that it has to mental health. Not spoken about quite so much, but there's lots of research, flawed in various ways. But for example, there's research that shows you that regular exercise is as effective as antidepressants if you've got mild to moderate depression. Things like that. Loads of stuff going on about thinking about this right now. You all know about interesting ways of designing active cities, so I won't go into it in more detail, just to note that it has value for mental health as well, so don't forget about that when you're trying to...
Just a really quick question. You see these gyms in parks, especially where I live, got a few of them, and you think, the outdoor spaces, is this what we're talking about here, in terms of improving mental health, like these sort of outdoor gyms in parks?
Yeah, I mean, it's one way. I think there's loads of different ways that you can improve physical activity, or just install it in the neighbourhood. Interestingly, those gyms, the research that I've seen, tends to actually have more benefits through the social interaction that they create than necessarily the physical activity. But yeah, you're right, absolutely. Having spaces where people can have like exercise classes. You see lots of squares, particularly in China and Japan, where people can, not really Japan, where people can get together and exercise together. It's about creating bike lanes, walking lanes, pedestrianisation, essentially different ways of being able to move. But you're right, these outdoor gyms have an interesting role in quite a lot of cities. And also just like, don't forget about the importance of having transport links to take people to other places that they might want to exercise. Thinking of Hong Kong, for example, there was this problem that you can see the hiking from your house, but there's no actual way to get to it. And then they started having these little buses that go up and things, and people are using that for exercise a lot more. I'm super nearly finished. I apologise. There's only 2 left, I think. Speed through this. The playable city, another interesting one. I mean, you're like, oh yeah, we all know about the child-friendly city, and I think that what the interesting bit for me is that people are really starting to think about playability, not just for children, but for the entire lifespan. And the benefits for adults are starting to come out in terms of interacting creatively with your city and interacting in ways that take you out of your normal context. So one of the pictures there is a reflection from the, what's it called, Cloudgate sculpture in Chicago, where people like to pose and see themselves reflected against the city. There's people playing Pokemon Go, there's people doing various activities. And yeah, there's loads of sort of new thinking at the moment about how to put playability into cities for across the whole lifespan. And I wrap it up with the inclusive city because everything is about the inclusive city, really. All of these things that are beneficial to people. They need to be able to be accessible to everyone. And it is sadly the case that a lot of design and planning decisions that have been made in the past have been made with a sort of vision of a sort of cultural, ethnic majority, able-bodied, middle-aged man going to work. And well, things are sort of changing. You see it all the time. You see it in how commutes have been designed. Usually you're going in and out of the city rather than round and about. You see that lots of journeys are designed for like there and back, whereas we know from the research. I mean, obviously it's making extrapolations, but in general, in the past it was men that went to work and came home again, whereas women would more traditionally, pop and pick up the kids. Pop and caring, all those sorts of things. I mean, I'm not implying that is what everyone does. But what's interesting when you look around the world is that quite often women are really disadvantaged by lots of the decisions that have been made about planning in particular and design. There's really cool examples in the book about people doing experiments where they essentially create themselves some obstacles and try and go about the city and find that actually they can't access all these brilliant benefits of the city for their mental and physical health because they're essentially stuck because it's been designed for somebody else. And I think that we all probably have a bit of a feel for the importance of universal design, but I just want to emphasize that in this framework that absolutely underpins what we're thinking about here. And you think about something like COVID, and suddenly people realise that parks are where they want to be in their hour, where they're allowed to go out of the house. It's good for their mental health, it gives them physical activity. They have a feel that a park is a really good thing. And then of course there is huge inequality of where high quality accessible parks might be. And I think it's made people stop and think, hasn't it? So like, wait a minute, suddenly I'm making these connections between mental health and physical environment, and actually I want more. And I think we're at a really interesting stage at the moment in our lives where actually some decisions might be about to be catalysed. Changes are being made in the environment, just pop-up things like extra wide streets or extra cycle lanes or pop-up parks, whatever it might be, that people couldn't really imagine before. But then COVID has given that facility to try to do a bit of innovation, and it's really making people think differently. So I think some of us within this part of this world are thinking about what interesting opportunities we should really seize coming out of the pandemic, because frankly it feels like a bit of a moral imperative to seize the benefits where we can. And the future's bright, the future's exciting, and I think this is an area where there's going to be so much more research, so I'm just encouraging you, to all get into it. It's going to be great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Can I invite Nicola to sit up here? Because the next, before we ask you to ask questions, sorry, I'm going to ask you all. Sit there. We have a wonderful opportunity to hear from our two discussants. We're going to give their thoughts and responses and then and interrogate our speakers, which is great if you happen to be the chair, because I'm just going to sit over here and enjoy. Right. So, Leslie, do you want to kick off? That would be good. Yeah.
Great,
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me at the back?
Yeah, I'm sure they
Thank
can.
you.
Yeah, they're nodding. Yeah.
Such fascinating presentations and so many things to say, but I'm just going to say a couple of things to give us plenty of space. I've been wondering, I love your sort of biosocial approach, Nicholas, and I've been wondering what a social determinants of health model might look like if we took that seriously, if we took the socio-material and mediated nature of our health and well-being seriously, and if we understood the factors that influence how we feel and how well we do, not as determinants, but as relational factors that work together in our bodies, in our minds, in our environments. It would be incredibly complicated, of course, but really important to try and do. My worry is that by saying that things are complex and relational, as I often do in my lectures, as my students will attest, that tends towards a kind of a big data response to policy and planning that misses the kind of the fine-grained micro relationships that are so important in health and well-being. If we take the social seriously in mental health and try to take its concern out of the black box of the brain, is there a danger of encountering challenges with a kind of more social model that might responsibilise communities or carers, for example? So, as someone that's been a carer, certain conditions are deemed to be social problems, and if you sort of take them out of the medical realm, then it becomes a responsibility of us to deal with, rather than something that's resourced and medicalised. And so it's very, very difficult to move concerns and conditions between realms. So I think we will need to have a kind of revitalised, very different kind of health policy landscape, or as I would call governance landscape, to address that complexity. In my research on well-being and green space, it became clear to me that people's engagement with the non-human world and nature, as we call it, was always socially activated or culturally mediated, and these mediators were often invisibilised. And in my work on well-being in parks in London, it became clear to me that friends groups, volunteers, community organisations played a hugely important role in people's well-being, in engaging and accessing spaces. And on the one hand, celebrating that and making it visible is really important. But on the other hand, these roles and responsibilities and politics are unaccountable. So there's a real, we need a shift in our politics as well as in our understanding, I would say. So I sort of wonder what the implications politically would be of taking these kind of relational perspectives seriously. I think I'll probably leave it there and give you some room, Hannah.
Okay, Hannah, please.
Thank you both so much. It was really interesting, and yeah, the talks went really well together. So I want to reflect on some experience that I've had, and then kind of respond to what you've said. So Henrietta and I both work on a randomised control trial of maternal mental health, postnatal depression in Nairobi and in Beirut. And our job on that project is to basically be the anthropologists, so social scientists of the team. Everyone else in the team are clinicians, psychologists mostly, and they've kind of said, okay, well you're kind of doing this work to understand what people understand by mental health and how they access mental health services, and what are the barriers that they experience accessing mental health services, and also all of the social determinants. And I find that our work is framed in a very particular way, which is decided by the discipline of psychology and maybe of public health and epidemiology. So it's quite, even when we're talking about social determinants, it's quite constrained in the way that we think about the relationships between human beings and the environments they live in. And it often doesn't have much room for what Nicholas was talking about, the kind of the affordances, the way that people change their environments and adapt their environments. It seems to be still quite static. And what I really love and value about both of your approaches is that you're trying to think about mental health from another side. You're not thinking about necessarily mental health disorders. You're using this WHO framework of understanding what it means simply to cope and even to thrive in one's environment, and that becomes our starting point. And I wanted to invite you to speak more about your inspirations, your starting points for your work, and what helped you to think differently about mental health from what I think seems to be the norm, which is this kind of clinical, medical view of mental health and disorder. And particularly how you put experience front and centre. The other thing that I found really fascinating was this interest in inclusivity or justice. And I wanted maybe to know if you'd heard of Clive Barnett's work on the sense of injustice. And he argues that basically when we talk about justice, we should really be talking about injustice, because that's where we're starting from. People sense injustice, and then we talk about justice, and goes back to that experience of feeling of the embodiment of your environment in yourself, and feeling as though you have been you don't matter anymore to that environment or to your society. And I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about injustice and mental health. And finally, I wanted to talk a bit more about power. So obviously power relations are important to injustice, and they're also, I think, probably therefore important to mental health, but particularly questions of the power of the planner. So if the planner is going to take these ideas and move forward with them, how are they going to make decisions about how we operationalise mental health in designing our cities, particularly the trade-offs that might need to be made. We've talked a lot about trade-offs in our work as well. We've noticed that, for example, in Euston, one of the projects that we've done there will be a housing project that the council says needs to happen because there's not enough housing in the area that's affordable, and it's especially designed. It sounds amazing from the outside perspective. You start talking to local kids who live in the area, it turns out their basketball court has gone. So there's trade-offs that need to be made when we talk about planning, particularly in cities that are already densely populated. So I wanted to know whether you see a kind of way forward of understanding those trade-offs and making decisions about trade-offs, and who has the power to make decisions about those. So yeah, that's it from me.
Wonderful comments from the discussants. Thank you both very much. Yes, and more questions that could possibly be answered in a week, I shouldn't think. But anyway, but Lena, would you like to have a go first with a couple of thoughts?
Go on then.
We'll ask Nick to come in and.
Okay, so on the first point about bringing mental health out of the clinic, sort of paraphrase. I think it's really interesting. As I said, I used to be a psychiatrist, and one of the reasons that I sort of moved from psychiatry into policy was that I felt very frustrated. Quite often people would come into my hospital ward, they would be very unwell, I would treat them, we would treat them, they would recover and they would go home. And then things that happened to them when they were out of the hospital led to them relapsing and having to come back. And we were discharging people. They were having to go into really problematic housing situations, problematic relationship situations, problems with money, problems with their job, all variety of things that would all have nothing to do with me writing them a prescription, but would very much have this massive impact on people's mental health. So I think that for me, that's what made me think we need to be looking at this wider. I was in this discussion just earlier today, actually. The government currently has a big consultation out about the future of mental health. And, I was making the point, even though I represent the NHS, I'm like, sure, but if we're actually going to help improve mental health over this country over the years, we have to stop just thinking about this as a clinical question. This is people's lives. It's every part of their lives, and it's this concept of health in all policies. And you hear about health in all policies in the physical health domain, but you don't hear about it quite so much in the mental health domain. So I think that this strategy that's coming out is going to have to cover things like housing and all these other factors if it's going to have any way of being successful. And I think that it's really a big part of resilience, isn't it? We've got this new concept of it's being talked about a lot at the moment, the resilient city. What does resilience mean? And they talk about it in terms of climate change, or in terms of all sorts of other things. But mental health needs to be part of the resilient city, and I think that in order to put mental health into all policies, you have to value it. You have to recognise the benefits of it. I'm going to really quickly try and answer all the questions really quickly. In terms of, I was interested in the inclusivity and justice, and certainly it's very much the case that people who have mental health problems quite often have less agency. They have less social capital, they have less ability to stand up and call for things. It's even interesting to think, people who have cancer, there's quite often a lot of people who will be standing up and shouting, we must find a cure for cancer, we're raising loads of money for cancer. You don't get that quite so much in mental health for the reasons that I mentioned, and I think that is a real problem, and it really disempowers people who need to have that support for mental health problems as well. And in many ways, in all the architects and planners I've been speaking to over the last few years, it comes down a lot to money. I mean, power and money. And, I talk about Hong Kong because I spent some time at the university there, who do some really interesting work in density. I didn't even speak about density, but if you're interested in density and mental health, that's the place where they're doing really cool stuff. But, I'd speak to developers and I would say, here's the ways that you can improve mental health. And they would say, yes, but every single centimetre of this space is making me money. And I don't know why I would give away a centimetre of this space for something that wasn't giving me money. And I would say, what would make you do that? And they would say, well, it's really about the client. What does the client value? Who is paying the money? Do they want to invest in mental health? Quite often, still, the answer to that is not really. And sometimes they hang that off, well, there's no evidence that this is going to be that useful. Well, the evidence is growing, so maybe there's shifts to be had. But I think from everything I've seen, it's all about the money. And just finally, on the social engagement stuff, absolutely. Loads of the stuff that I look at is about how do you improve social engagement. How do you design spaces that facilitate volunteering and altruism in different ways? And even the process of design gives you that opportunity, because you do loads of consultation. If you can make that more diverse, if you can engage the locals not just in a cursory survey, but really in getting into co-designing and sometimes even co-maintaining places, then it's not just that you design better places because they're better suited to the diverse people who've engaged in the consultation, but actually just by being there and being in the consultation, it builds the social capital in that area. So there's just a few random thoughts that I had, and I'm going to pass over to you.
Yes, Nick, please. Thank you very much, Nick.
Just start with two negative experiences of trying to do the kinds of things I wanted to do. The first, just sparking off what Layla just said. When I was at King's College, just starting to do some work with my colleague Ilana Singh, who's now at Oxford, there was a huge, great redevelopment in the Elephant and Castle, smashing down a vast estate whose name is currently escaped my mind, and building a whole new gentrified estate. Everybody was moved out of the old estate. We thought this would be a tremendous opportunity for looking at the mental health consequences and building some mental health issues into planning. We talked with the developers, who I believe are called something like Lease Lend.
Yes.
After many discussions, we got the local mental health people involved. After many, many discussions, they said, well, we will give you a grant of £25,000 to explore the mental health consequences of this. I mean, this was a multi-billion-pound redevelopment, so yeah, they're not going to get very much money out of it. And secondly, I have had many experiences like Hannah has, when we've been involved with neuroscientists and other life scientists. They said, oh, we must get some social scientists involved. Maybe you can run a focus group for us. Please, can you run a focus group for us? Find out what people really think, because we've got these difficult mums here, you know, they might get upset, so you know how to deal with them. And to actually break down those questions and to say you take their argument seriously, but they need to take your argument seriously, is a huge effort, to which I've devoted far too many of my long years. Some successfully in a couple of things, successfully a little bit in the work that we did in Shanghai and in Sao Paulo. In fact, so successfully in Sao Paulo that my colleague in Sao Paulo, Laura Andrade, who is an epidemiologist and a clinician, has pretty much decided that what she wants to do in the future is do anthropological work in the favelas of Sapopemba. So sometimes it can work. Sometimes it can work. I think just building on a few of the issues, and maybe my starting point. Okay, my starting point. First of all, I was originally a biologist, and I could not understand, because I was a biologist, trained as a biologist in the 1960s, when the world for our students was exploding all around us, and I couldn't understand how biologists were thinking that somehow the organisms that they studied and the physical and mental states of the organisms that they studied could be studied in distinct laboratory conditions without understanding how they lived and suffered in the world, in the real worlds in which they live. And that's always been a sort of a motivation for me, and also as someone who has worked in biological and neurological sciences, learning their language, getting people to understand that you wish to speak to them as colleagues, not simply as service providers, I think is very, very important. The second thing, I suppose, and maybe this is where I have a little bit of a difficulty with Layla's diagrams, is that we talk about us, planners, social scientists, anthropologists, and they, people with mental health problems and mental distress. Well, I don't take the figures too seriously, but if you take the 1 in 4 figure seriously, I don't know how many of us in this room are they, not we. I've had many, many friends, and myself have been a mental health service user. And I start from the experience, whatever's meant by experience, that's another bag of worms, I know, but with the experience of mental health service users. So when I look at Layla's lovely diagrams, the only city they look like to me is Canberra, which I happen to like Canberra, but it's laid out, you know, a planned city. It doesn't bear too much relationship with the favelas that we looked at in Sao Paulo, or with the urban villages that we looked at in Shanghai. Doesn't bear much relationship to that. And secondly, I think we're looking at these with a planner's eye, and I want to know how the people who are working and living and moving through those environments are experiencing those environments. I happen to live quite near here. I saw these diagrams of the reorganisation of Tottenham Court Road, which had lots of green spaces. There are going to be green spaces down the middle of Tottenham Court Road with little park benches on them, and people are going to be sitting in the middle of Tottenham Court Road under trees, greening Tottenham Court Road. Believe me, that is not the experience of anybody who's tried to negotiate Tottenham Court Road. So I would start with the experience of the individuals concerned by trying to find out how they live. All right, some of this stuff about niches may seem a bit abstracted, but it really is an attempt to find out the experiential world of the people who live in cities, and how that experiential world can be transformed from their point of view. And yes, their bitter sense of injustice, and their bitter sense of having no power whatsoever, of being included just as tokens, a little token group. Oh, we met with the residents here, so now we know what the views are of the residents. Having no sense that they can really control the reshaping of their environment, even if in the favelas they have to some extent reshaped their environments, but in very, very constrained ways. So there are questions of power and the experience of injustice. Just one last point from Liza's comment. I agree with Henrietta when she says that the experience of people in the earliest years, the experience of children in their homes, their experience of stress, their experience of toxicity, their experience of domestic violence, their experience of poor diets, etc., can have very, very significant effects upon their future mental health. But there's a very delicate tipping point between that and the I blame the mother discourse that we're all very, very familiar with. And in fact, I was shipped off to Argentina to give a talk in Buenos Aires, where there are many people who are very heavily influenced by the line of argument called the developmental origins of health and disease, or something like somewhat similar, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, who believe that everything happens actually in the very earliest years of the child's experience, and perhaps even in pregnancy. So in some areas in South Africa, where I'm working with a colleague of mine, Michelle Pentecost, every woman who approaches childbearing age is the potential target of an intervention to stop them smoking, to stop them drinking, to get them eating healthily so that they will bring up a healthy child. And the other side of that is, of course, that the unhealthy child, the child with mental health problems, is an economic burden on the community. And if there's one word that I absolutely would like to remove from the language of debate about mental health, it is, what is the global burden of mental health? I live with people who have mental health, and mental health problems, whatever they are, and I think the idea that they are a burden is deeply, deeply offensive. But I agree that there is a danger that once you start thinking like that, responsibilization and early intervention becomes the way in which you go forward, and that ignores the very features of systemic structural violence across the life course that are not just a matter of what happens in the earliest years of the child. Anyhow, I've rabbited on for far too long. Excuse me, it's a long time since I've been in a face-to-face environment.
I know, we're getting overexcited now, aren't we?
No one's pressing the button, so muting my microphone.
Let me just defend your criticism of these pictures, because it's clear in the book, but it's obviously not clear at the talk. But obviously, every city is different. All around the world, cities are going to look very, very different. Neighbourhoods are going to look different. And never would I be suggesting that that's what they should be looking like. That's just an illustrative example of components that might be helpful to think about within the context of wherever you are. Quite a lot of the focus that we have in this research is localization. What is appropriate for the particular people who live and work and use this particular part of the world, and making decisions based on that, but using some of these theories to make them a bit more mentally healthy.
Sorry for setting you up as a
oh, it's fine, it's fine. It's funny, nobody's ever mentioned that before, but then you said it, and I thought I should probably clarify that in my speeches, in case everybody thinks she wants them all to look like Canberra.
Very good. Well, maybe this would be a great moment to open up for a few questions from the floor. So can we do that? Are you going to be very shy? No, there's one at the back, Fabio, and then one here, please. Fabio. You might have to shout.
I think there's some mics. I don't know if they're...
Go ahead, shout. Once the mic's coming.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation and also discussants for the contributions. My question is, so when we look at happiness rankings, we usually find Nordic countries at the very top, so Iceland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and so on. And I mean, happiness rankings, they have their limitations, but even when we look at well-being metrics that take into account a wider set of indicators, these countries rank on top. I lived in Sweden for some time, and I remember that it was so cold, minus 20 degrees. I couldn't really be in the city. Everything. I had a good time, but I had to go somewhere else. I had to go to someone's house or to be in a student accommodation because it was just too cold to be outside. And it's not just only that. Also, like countries that instead have a lot of public spaces that are meant to promote that engagement that we talked about. I'm thinking about Mediterranean countries, Italy, Spain, Greece, but also Latin American countries. They usually almost always rank not at the very bottom, but nevertheless they perform worse than these countries. And so I'm always confused by this, and I wonder what your interpretation of these findings would be.
Yes. Okay, great. Let's take the second question and then we'll come to an answer.
I
Yeah.
have a question for each.
Okay, first go ahead, please, and then
Okay,
we'll take
first
more.
is Professor Rose. I was interested, thank you. I was interested in the potential theory in psychology, which goes back to what we were talking about in terms of Argentina, where people are asked to smoke and diet and exercise and things like that, because there's been some really good research talking about the potential of early childhood playing a massive part in terms of physical, mental health, emotional health, all that sort of stuff. So that's the first question. And I think that one is chastised for smoking or not having the healthiest diet, then I could really see the negative of that. So I'm interested to hear what you think about that potential theory. And the second question is for Dr. Kay. I'm really interested in the relationship between clinical perspective and planning and society. Because, funny enough, my office, I'm a counsellor, my office is right around the corner from Liverpool Street Station, it sure is. And I found that my office has become a linchpin for people from both working in the city, Shoreditch, but also the other end, a lot of calls from people from disadvantaged backgrounds, Whitechapel, that. And I found that this office run place has really helped people to unify around it and to use this as a support. So what I'm looking at doing, setting up a charity trying to help people from many different diversities. But I'm thinking about having those linchpins of the different mental health services, the linchpin, in the same way that we were talking about in terms of the different spaces in your book. And I was just interested to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Great. Well, there are three questions there, so let's take, Mick, why don't you go on Fabio's
Happiness.
Yeah. Happiness in cold climates.
Happiness in cold climates. Yes,
exactly.
right.
What is the reason for it?
Yeah,
that's the question. Yeah.
Well, the interesting, I, for various reasons, spent a lot of time in Finland and some of the other Nordic countries. If you go to Finland, you also see that along with a high happiness index is a high alcoholism index. These are not, the two are not positively correlated, I think. So there are huge questions of alcohol consumption, overconsumption in all those Nordic countries. So I'm not entirely clear how the happiness indices are developed, apart from the fact that those are high income for many people, high income, high tax, high social services, high childcare facilities, etc., societies. I've also had a lot of Nordic researchers in my time. When, unfortunately, from my perspective, they get hitched up with one another and decide that they want to have kids, they all go back home. They all go back home because they know that they can never get the level of social support that they can get in their own country from certainly not in the UK. Should we move from having the global burden of disease to happiness indices? I think there is something to be said for that, although it has to be said I am slightly sceptical of the happiness industry. I used to be at the London School of Economics, where one of my colleagues was Richard Layard, who, as you may know, was a big wheel in the happiness, in arguments about happiness. And I was never truly convinced, and perhaps that is partly because I think that to live a flourishing life is not necessarily to live a happy life. But maybe that's going to get us into difficult ethical territory. I rather agree with Nietzsche that happiness is a rather shallow condition. But when I say that in the United States, they all say, "Oh, how European." Just quickly on the other one, the potential of early childhood. Again, in my long and varied career, perhaps the first paid job I got was after being a teacher in a school for maladjusted children, was working for the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, who were doing research in preschool development. And I came across those arguments then, and they seemed as problematic then as they do now, because the kids who were coming into the preschool playgroups that were run by the NSPCC were kids who came from the most terribly deprived families with loads of domestic violence, living in awful conditions, and having, to put it very simply, absolutely zero expectations of what a life could give to them. And it seems to me that before one starts to think about other things, one should start to think about some of the material conditions within which people are forced to live and which they have no power to control. Yes, it's fine to say healthy diet, but if you go on the bus from King's College London, where I used to work, out to Camberwell, where the Institute of Psychiatry is, you see people's life expectancy going down and down and down every bus stop you go past. That's Michael Marmot's position, and you see the diets getting worse and worse, and the number of pawn shops and cheap fast food shops getting greater and greater the more you go down the 68 bus route. So I would start to do something about some of those material conditions myself.
As for the happiness, I have a complicated relationship with happiness, because in some ways I think it's really positive that rankings like that and, you know, gross domestic happiness and all these things, they try to quantify, they try to put a value on mental well-being, and that is a good thing because you want people to value that and thus invest in it. But I also don't really like happiness as a measure, because I mean, I'm all about the mental health, and mental health and happiness are not the same thing. So I think in some ways it's a bit superficial and it's difficult. But I was musing when you were talking about what the difference is, and I was thinking, well, what I wrote down was what I think the differences are. A feeling of justice, agency, security and trust. I think that's the sorts of things that tend to up the happiness levels, and might be some way to explaining some of those disparities. In terms of your question, that's quite a complicated question. I'm not quite sure whether I've got the answer to it. I mean, it sounds brilliant. I think that there's lots of interesting questions about gentrification within that, and I think that it makes me think of the importance of what they call third spaces. So, you know, places that people can go and be that they don't have to spend money in. Few and far between indoor spaces like that. And it offers all sorts of opportunities if you can create a third space where people can go and hang out with whatever purpose that may be, without something being specifically asked of them. And I think that when I was thinking about that, I was thinking the opportunity here is to bring in diversity, bring in intergenerational opportunities so that people have natural ways of having positive social interactions. And in some ways it's like designing a street in microcosm, isn't it? It's designing those different facilities that people would come to use, and then have those bumping spaces where they would see each other and have natural interactions in the middle. So those were some of the things I was thinking about when you were raising that. Thanks.
Henrietta, can I offer something?
Yes, of course.
So just on your question of the therapeutic space as a kind of space where people can meet one another, I guess.
Well, that was actually one of my point of meeting. It was more the fact of how we're able to use mental health as a resource for people with different, you know, talk about counselling, it's very one-on-one. And the NHS, unfortunately, I'm sure as a psychiatrist, NHS waiting times are 6 months to 9 months on average. And I'm just thinking about how we're able, just on that note, there's a great charity called Change, which is a coffee charity set up by someone who, called Jamal Zell actually, and he created a charity for people who were homeless. And rather than solve the issue, he created these vans. You see them all around this one borough market, all over the place. And it was a resource to help people to essentially earn money by not solving the big issue. And what I'm hoping to do is saying, okay, how are we able to have a mental health resource for people to get access, to help them to have that support that they need. It's not just counselling. Yeah, the space, the third space is short, but you know, there's a great potential here for a lot of people to self-actualise and actually be able to create a life for themselves. That's really what it is. Well, so that, sorry, I didn't make that clear.
No, I don't think about it then. No, don't worry about it.
All right, shall we take this a couple more before we stop? Yes, Kate, please. Anyone else? Okay, let's go. Yeah, and behind you. Okay, so Kate first and then behind, please. Yeah.
Okay, hi. That was really interesting. Thank you. I've got a question about, well, kind of an anecdote that will draw together 3 questions about ageing, gender, and the housing market. Actually, like you mentioned, gentrification and also intergenerational houses. And I was wondering if you had examples, positive examples of how the housing market can be regulated to produce those, because I have the impression that in the UK, the main trajectory is kind of going against the creation of those kind of spaces. And what made me think of that was a friend of mine's dad had Alzheimer's in Plymouth, and he at the beginning, when he started kind of wandering around, he was familiar enough with the area that people would kind of recognise him and take him home. But as the university grew in Plymouth, as Airbnb grew over about 10 years, that kind of community space wasn't there, and he got quite nostalgic for it. And was really clearly articulating a kind of need for a community response to mental health issues, and saying that if only people, if only I was in a neighbourhood, then people would be able to, I'd be able to wander around more. And that in turn made me think that going back to the division between urban and rural, and whether that's a valid division between urban and rural in terms of mental health, that the burden of that community response will quite likely fall on women, depending on where you are, and that maybe some women, certain women I've spoken to have made that, in Latin America, made that rural urban migration. One of the motivations was to get away from that burden, actually, that care, like their words, that burden, and the kind of quite maddening double binds that can create as well. So the kind of question is, firstly, the housing market regulation, but also in terms of the narratives of mental health in the city, how important is it to, or what differences and possibly trade-offs can be brought up by looking intersectionally at those different narratives?
Yeah, right, thank you. And then behind, please.
So I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, we
I guess my question was around, do you think there is or believe there's a role in cultural beliefs or kind of cultural identity with how individuals interact with their urban spaces? So Nicholas, I think you mentioned trying to understand more about how people experience their spaces to then find ways to make those spaces perhaps restorative. And I'm just wondering, when I think of urban spaces, I often think of cities, populated spaces which have quite diverse ethnic groups. And I wonder, kind of cultural beliefs, if that plays a role into how people then might interact with a green space or, a curious space. Would they want to interact with those spaces in the same way, perhaps because of cultural beliefs or identity that they're carrying from that migrant culture that brought them there?
Okay, great questions. Right. So, Bella, you want to go first?
Sure. In terms of sort of intergenerational homes, there's a lot of thinking being done about that, but probably the most progress is being made in various continental European cities. There's quite a lot of thinking. I mean, it's really more. I was going to say, is there great policy out there? I'm not sure there is. I would say that there's more pilots and cool case studies rather than a whole place that I can point to that's doing this well. But one way of thinking about it is some places are developing very very flexible apartment blocks stroke places around the apartment blocks where they're flexible as to your needs across the lifespan. So you can be living in a building that is appropriate for a full family, then you might move out, but actually you can still be in that area because you can get like sort of student flats. Then you can expand it again for your family. You can expand it further if you want to bring in your parents, and essentially it's all done with sort of in some of the case studies I'm thinking of, it's done with adjustable walls and all these sort of flexibility ways of doing things. And also, I guess that links to the second thing. I'm sort of mixing my case studies here, but there's some interesting work that's done on. There are certain neighbourhoods that will attract people of a particular stage in their life, and how is it that you can bring in the investment to keep them there? So, flitting from one thing to another, sorry about that, but I'm thinking, for example, quite often when immigrants who come to a city who don't have much money will find themselves in some cheap and dodgy part of town that they will aspire to leave. Is one route by which migrants might come into the city, and there's some work that's interesting that's being done about how can you spark investment in those areas so that people won't just abandon them and create a bit of a longer term investment. And that sort of speaks to your other point of the challenges of, you know, women finding themselves burdened by staying and being and wishing they could leave. And I mean, there's not a good answer to that, I don't think. But one way of addressing that, in the time that I've been reading about, is this concept of keeping different generations in the same sort of area to ease the burden on the one person who is the primary carer. I'll just quickly take the cultural identity in spaces thing, which is really interesting. This is an area that I really like. Then there's loads of cool case studies. One that I'm thinking of is around biking in various of the UAE countries, and essentially the biking being good for you physically and mentally. Not always when it's insanely hot, but women feeling like they don't necessarily have the cultural access to biking for all sorts of different reasons. And there's loads of really cool research that's done on what would make that more culturally appropriate for anyone who wants to hop on a bike and take advantage of that. So yeah, cool research is being done on this, and it's very much linked to what do the policies look like. They were potentially designed with the vision of the able-bodied man, etc., etc. And once you do all the appropriate research and understand what are the cultural determinants, then you can change the policies in ways that might work, might not work. Vienna does cool work on this as well, particularly in parks for women. They did lots of research that showed that, you know, certain parks were only really used by teenage boys, for example, and the girls felt like they weren't really welcome or they didn't have access. And again, lots of research was done. They made interesting changes, like changing where the access routes were to the parks, creating more access and creating different sort of semi-segmented areas so that people were more able to share the space, doing things with lighting to change the feelings of safety, etc. So yeah, from my perspective, what the work that people are doing on this at the moment is quite focused on understanding what are the barriers, what are the incentives, and then changing the design and changing the policy. Great. Nick?
Yeah, I just, on your anecdotes rather than your question, because I don't know that much apart from anecdotally myself about housing markets, but I do know a bit about ageing. So I think some interesting work about how you reconfigure the city to scaffold, as the term I've used, to scaffold the capabilities of individuals who are maybe differently abled is done in the area of cities for ageing, healthy ageing cities. There's quite a lot of work being done in Scotland about how you make a city legible to people who are beginning to lose their capacities to see, to hear, to read road signs, to remember the way back, and so on. And these are often quite simple kinds of things about signage, about colouring, about making pathways clear, and so on. And they're also quite simple things to think about, but almost impossible things to do, about how you make it possible to walk along a street. I don't know if anyone in this audience has had restricted vision. I happened to have eye surgery a while ago. I have very restricted vision. And it's almost impossible to walk down a street these days because there are so many obstacles in the way, not parking meters, they've done away with those, but you know, there are bits where people are working, there are road signs, etc., etc., etc. To simply walk down a street, even in London, let alone in some of the streets in the global south, is really an extremely difficult environment for anybody who's not young, fit, etc., etc., etc. So I think what one needs to do is to think about how you make these spaces, how you scaffold people's capabilities to make their lives within these spaces, which is different from programming those spaces, but just making it possible for people to use and transform those spaces themselves. And the other thing about cultural identity and cultural beliefs is that I think spaces are highly gendered, spaces are highly raced, spaces are highly aged. Just around London at the moment, our dear Mayor of London is doing a lot to create cycle lanes. Well, cycle lanes are all very fine, but and I ride my bike in other places, but I'm not going to ride my bike up and down Gower Street, thank you very much, because it's extremely dangerous. And yet, as elderly person, I find it incredibly difficult to cross Gower Street these days because there are bikes zooming around in every direction, usually not on the cycle lanes, but on the pavements as well. So the spaces are designed, whether they're designed with the norm of the able-bodied white European male is another question which we could go into, but they're certainly designed with certain images of the persons who are going to be able to use those spaces. And I think we need to recognise that there is a very wide bandwidth of being human, very many different ways in which people are human, with many different capacities, and that they're not well served by the spaces they're in. And also, spaces are gendered. I mean, there's a lot about green space, but I know a lot of women who will not go into parks at night because they're absolutely not green space friendly. They're out of the gaze. They prefer to walk down a crowded street with lots of street lights than to go into a green space. And there are lots of spaces where people of different ethnic identities will not go because they feel threatened, they're unfriendly to them, and they'll prefer to stay in places that they feel more friendly to. So I think the spaced, the aged, raced, gendered nature of spaces is really crucial. And that is why, just to beat my drum yet again, I think the only way to understand this is to understand how people, the people who are using the spaces, how they're experiencing the spaces, and what it would be about the spaces and places that would enable them to grab control of their lives and make their lives the way in which they want to make their lives.
Wonderful. Now, we're very much out of time, but there's just one very quick comment from here, and then we will wrap up. Yeah?
Thank you so much. It's not a question, it's a request for dialogue, really. I'm from the new interdisciplinary Masters in Creative Health, where we're doing social prescribing and stuff like that. I've just taken the Urban Health module with Professor Osrin, and I've done health ethics with Professor Wilson. We are at that intersect of policy and service delivery, and including people with the lived experience, because quite a few of us on my course, my peers, have quite a lot to contribute in the way of lived experience. So if anybody wants to get in touch with us, probably Professor Helen Chatterjee or Dr. Thomas Cato here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So look, we've had a wonderful afternoon, very wonderful speeches and interventions from our discussants too. And so I think what we should do is, first of all, just to remind you that there is a drink and a snack for those of you who wish it just outside the store here. Follow anyone who looks particularly thirsty, that is anyone in the LGB, you will find it. But let me just say thank you all for coming, and thank you, Leila and Nick, for wonderful presentations, and Hannah and Liza for great discussion, I think. Thank you very much.